Welcome to tonight's episode. And I'm just so delighted to have my first official guest, my first live guest. This is so cool for me. Here I've got Megan and Gabrielle, the organizers with Fossil Free Guelph. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I might be kind of dealing with some little tech issues on the fly. Let me just check with my tech to make sure that everything is all good. But hopefully people are hearing me and hopefully people are seeing you. And I just got the thumbs up that everything is good to go. So awesome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Fossil Free Guelph. So you're kind of the champions right now at this moment of fossil fuel divestment in Canada. The university voted, the investment committee and the board of directors voted to divest from fossil fuels. My understanding is that they do it gradually. Is that right? It's not like you flip the switch and they divest. Do you know how long it's going to take them to be fully out of fossil fuels?
Our ask was gradually over a 5-year period. So 5 years from April 2020
Amazing.
Should be when they have fully divested.
Amazing. So I remember going to a chant here in Toronto, and it was like one of these climate change protests, and it was like, what do we want? Fossil fuel divestment. When do we want it? Like gradually over the next 5 years. Which is definitely one of my favorite chants of all time.
Definitely ours too.
Yeah.
And so I was a little bit worried because I saw the timing of the announcement, and it was like right when oil cratered. And it was like right when there was just like, so, my line was like, oh, they should have done it, a month ago. But, it sounds like it is going to be a very gradual, process over the next 5 years, that it's not like they're going to try to time it or anything like that. And I assume that that's very much sort of part of the plan there. So, really what I'm hoping is just to kind of chat with you for a little bit and, get a sense of your journey over the last probably 4 or 5 years, whenever you two got involved, knowing that this was, very much a team effort. And I think it has been over 7 years that Fossil Free Guelph has been advocating for this?
Yeah. We both joined about 4 years ago. But the campaign started at U of G 7 years ago with a great group of dedicated activists who really did a lot of work to get the ball rolling before we even came along.
And then can you give me a sense of how big is the team?
It's quite large. It fluctuates a lot kind of depending on people's capacity. Yeah. But anywhere from 7 or 8 of us to sometimes as many as 30 people in a room kind of organizing and figuring out what our steps should be.
Yeah. Fantastic. That's so cool. And so, the two of you personally, when did you get involved?
I think we both got involved very early.
So it was right after you got to Guelph, first year.
Yeah, I want to say I got involved end of first year kind of thing, once we had figured out our bearings of university a little bit.
Right.
Yeah, I got involved at the beginning of my second year.
Cool. Amazing. Yeah. And I'm just really curious, your first experience. So you get involved, you're probably feeling like there, some older students there, so you're learning. I imagine, you probably didn't have a lot of knowledge about investments and, structures. And so, your first experience with either the board of directors or the investment committee, it's such a wild system. What was your early experience there like?
It was definitely a bit intimidating kind of coming into a group, especially as a young student, kind of not as familiar with the movement and seeing all these really passionate, wonderful people, but they were very supportive and kind of guided us.
I feel like they were really great in helping us learn what we needed to know really quickly and just opening up, the doors for us to get involved. However we felt comfortable at the beginning. There was no pressure, but I remember just sitting in several meetings in the first, little while I was involved, just listening and trying to absorb all of the information and being so excited because it was so interesting.
Amazing. Amazing. And then, you know, throughout the course, and we did get a little question here. So chat, like, throw your questions in the chat. I will open it up to Q&A. I kind of want to get through a little bit of your journey before I sort of open it up to questions. But, you know, one of the things that's always been really cool to me have been some of the direct actions. And this is, I know, a little bit controversial, right? Because here you are trying to like push for change and do it in a way that, you know, is going to be a little bit abrasive at times. But also, like with the investment committee, like, you know, you kind of, sometimes I think people get worried that you're going to offend people or turn people off, or that, you know, can be a little bit too harsh in that way. So, you know, I'm just really curious to hear your experience with direct actions and, like, you know, any learning that you had in terms of what worked or what didn't, or like, you know, really how did you, you know, how did direct action contribute to this win?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like it's been a long journey with the board and with the student body and the community throughout Guelph, which has been wonderful. And we really started off with a bit more big actions, and by we, I mean as the group, we weren't involved at that point in time. But all of those actions and the noise and campaigning on campus led to the special action policy request process being created by the university, and that gave us an avenue into kind of a more diplomatic coming to the table with the board and the investment committees, because we submitted a request that requested for divestment on the basis that the fossil fuel industry commits social injury by perpetuating climate change and through their human rights abuses. So that was our main kind of in that we started really having these intense conversations with the board.
Right.
Yeah, and right around the special action policy era, to say, of Fossil Free Guelph was when Gabby and I both joined. So we actually came into a very bureaucratic way of doing things, where it was all about writing that formal report, and you know that led to preparing a presentation for the board. And I remember that first time that we presented in front of the board with our PowerPoint and our pitch and everything in relation to what we had put in the special action policy. So the first, I would say, like 2 or 3 years of being in Fossil Free was very much like board oriented and kind of going through their bureaucratic processes and speaking in front of the board.
Right.
And
it's a pain. Like I've done a little bit of board work, but it's like they meet quarterly. It takes you like quarters to get on the agenda. Once you're on the agenda, you have like a tiny little space of time. So you would have been like, and it's like they're all sitting there in their like chairs of power, feeling very comfortable with their coffee or whatever. And then it's just like, okay, like time for your dog and pony show.
Yeah, I have never been as scared as I was the first time I stood up in front of the board and spoke. I think I was sweating. I was shaking in my boots. It was terrifying.
Oh my God.
But
that's amazing. But so good to like to you know step up into that, and such an incredible experience there. And then, you know, is there a moment where you did feel there was a bit of a tipping point at all? Like when did you feel the momentum change? Because I know there was a lot of resistance, you know, for a long time. And so, you know, when did you feel the tide start to turn?
We came to a point where the board had sent back the special action policy request and rejigged it several times, which was getting very frustrating for us, because they never actually directly addressed our ask. They always kind of tried to step around it, which ended up with them creating a strategic framework for investing and overall lowering the ESG scores of their portfolio as a whole, which felt very diluted and not at all what we were asking for.
Totally.
But they were very proud of themselves for that recommendation, and were patting themselves on the back and kind of closed the door on discussion with us. And so that point was about a year ago, I want to say. A year ago.
Okay.
And we were definitely very defeated because we didn't really know what else to do. We had kind of exhausted all of our avenues of, you know, diplomatic communication with the board. So we kind of had to regroup and re-strategize, and I'll let Gab, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, it was a real roller coaster of those years of kind of maintaining these good relations with the boards and trying to push forwards the special action policy request, while also trying to maintain momentum in the movement on campus and make sure that just because it's in closed doors in these meetings, it's not forgotten by the student body, and that noise and pressure is maintained. And then, it was a real hard blow it was just a year and a bit ago, in January, when they made that decision they kind of just sidestepped our request altogether and didn't address divestment.
And so let me just dig into that just for a moment, because so I went to my alma mater is Dalhousie, and I think they kind of had the same situation where, pushing for divestment, and then the board came back, the investment committee came back saying, okay, ESG, that we're going to use ESG, best in class, we're going to get rid of the worst of the worst, but we're not going to do this negative screening, which I think is kind of similar to what happened there. And, it's hard for me because I looked at that's a huge win, getting them to do ESG. And I get that for you, it's not far enough. And I guess what I'm hearing from you is that really it didn't address your fundamental concern, that your fundamental concern wasn't with the broad ESG risk across all sector, that for you it really is this issue of climate change, and almost as it relates to a human rights issue. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously the ESG and that decision by the board was a good decision. And we don't want to speak ill on that decision because it was really wonderful, and a good first step.
Yeah.
But we didn't see that as addressing our request.
Okay.
What we were pushing for, because under that ESG portfolio, a lot of the carbon intensive industries are not the fossil fuel industry,
right.
Strangely enough, under their the way that they defined it.
That's right. And this has been an issue for a lot of my viewers and my clients, because you get these ESG funds, like we have these investment funds, and Suncor will be in there, and Enbridge will be in there, and it's always like often a giant head scratcher, that where it's just like it doesn't seem to line up with people's expectations on it. And although it is often, a really good step, and I'm a big believer in, ESG, and that now with all the evidence that we have, that, in terms of performance, that like it totally makes sense. But what I'm hearing is you were very much of the sort of the spirit of like not one penny. And so, it really didn't go far enough for you. So how did you as an organization sort of rebound from that and then get divestment back on the table?
It was a journey. So after that vote, we definitely felt a bit defeated. And so we kind of went back to the drawing board a bit, and kind of reassessed, like, how do we restructure our group? How do we maintain kind of momentum in this movement now that we feel like all the diplomatic or previous avenues that we've had to discuss this with the board have now been shut. And so we started turning more to more peaceful, direct action, and kind of making a little bit more loud of a voice on campus. So we started with attending their board meetings. I think the first one in October, we came outside with signs and tape over our mouths to show that we felt like we were being silenced by this protest and that they weren't hearing us or listening to us. And I think that did hit hard a little bit with the board, because they had felt to some degree like they'd done what we wanted to a degree. And I think that, and then the following board meeting in January, in which we came in with a letter from the CSA that said their support for divestment.
And what's the CSA?
The Central Student Association.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So amazing. So showing even more support, showing that. And then did you know that it was going to be on the board agenda for this last meeting?
No. So we had that meeting in January, and we put up signs kind of addressing the conflict of interest of people at the board, including Martha Billis.
Yeah,
enough.
One of our new tactics there was trying to call out the conflicts of interest that we found on the board, and the biggest one that we did find, ironically, was Martha Billis.
Yeah.
Okay. And and we're going to get to Martha in a moment, because she plays a pretty big role, but to let people know, she's the chancellor, or she was the chancellor, meaning, you know, the sort of person that hands out diplomas, and that a bit of a ceremonial position. And my understanding is didn't have voting rights on the board, but was obviously very involved and had a loud voice. Is that right?
We're slightly confused about that because she has voted and she did vote against divestment actually during the board meeting.
So curious.
Without declaring any kind of conflict of interest. So we're not entirely sure what their process is with that. We haven't been able to get a direct answer.
Okay, so you started going after them and kind of calling out the conflicts and, you know, some of the obvious bias that was at play there. And so it sounds like you're getting, you know, you're getting sort of through there. And then from there, you know, how did you find out about this? Like, if you didn't know that it was on the agenda, like, how did you get the news?
Well, we actually, what happened was in the beginning of March, as you may be aware, with the Wet Sweatin' movement across the country, we followed a call out for action from the Western Hereditary Chiefs, and organized a occupation of the finance executive offices, calling them to immediately withdraw their money from TC Energy. They were one of the main holders of the pipeline.
Absolutely. And this used to be TransCanada. They've rebranded as TC Energy. And this is a stock that would be inside of the pension. And so, you know, wow. So you just like literally camped out, like set up shop there.
It was an hour-long occupation.
Okay.
So we had 150 students come into the office and hold up space, and make some noise and engage in a very tough and powerful conversation with Don O'Leary, who's the Vice President of Finance at the university.
And it was through that action and the conversations that came out of the students and Don O'Leary. It was a very intense environment, that's for sure.
Wow.
And it was through that during that day, at the end of the sit-in, Don O'Leary on video said that he would commit to making a recommendation for full divestment to the Finance and Investment Committees to then be brought to the full Board of Governors.
Wow. Okay, so this is pre-COVID. This is when,
pre-COVID.
Right? Right? But this wasn't that long ago. Like, it's really amazing how we're in a bit of a time warp right now. So that and then the board meeting must have come very soon after that.
Yeah.
And so was your timing, did you sort of anticipate that board meeting?
Yeah, so they always have a board meeting towards the end of April. And we knew that we wanted to get this item, you know, back up as soon as we possibly could.
Yeah.
We didn't know when, we didn't know how.
Yeah.
But yeah, after Don O'Leary committed to making that recommendation, he brought it to the Finance and Investment Committees. And at that point, COVID had happened. So we were all sitting at home. But we continued to have virtual meetings with Don O'Leary and heard the updates on how it got approved at the investment subcommittee meeting and then approved at the finance committee meeting.
Whoa. Okay. So first it goes to the investment committee.
Yeah.
And you get approval there.
Yes.
And then it goes to the finance committee with the recommendation and it gets approved there. And then it goes to the board meeting.
Yeah. Lots of steps.
And this was the final, you know, so the final, it's like, this is like the boss battle here where, you know, and it's a closed door meeting. So you weren't in there. Is that correct?
We were in the Board of Governors meeting, just not the finance and investment meetings.
Awesome. And so are you like is this a virtual meeting now? So we're now in COVID. So you're like watching it on Zoom or whatever.
Yeah. And we actually did have speaking rights at that meeting. So Gab and I and two other members of Fossil Free did a pitch to the board that day as well. With all other members of Fossil Free also listening in.
Yeah.
Old and young, which is really cool. So some members who started the movement 7 years ago were able to listen into the call.
Yeah.
Which was cool.
And then you would have been present for that vote that they would have voted right after. And so describe to me your emotions, like, because it's one person at a time, or like it's like everyone, and it's virtual now, so I don't even know how you do that. But like, describe for me your emotions as you sort of watch that moment unfold.
It was a real roller coaster, that's for sure.
It really was.
The wildest part was to definitely see Don O'Leary and some of the big finance executives have completely changed their mindset. I think once Don committed to making that recommendation, he, obviously worked really hard on it and came to see, I think, a lot that our arguments were very valid and true. And that it wouldn't negatively affect the returns on investments, and that they could do well in other portfolios. And so just getting to hear them talk about it in such supportive language, the way we had been explaining it for years, was wild.
Yeah, it felt so surreal to hear our words regurgitated from the mouths of folks who hadn't always been supporters of this, to say the least. And then it kind of took a turn for the worse. As it kind of opened up for questioning, and Martha Billis and Garrett Boss were against it, and they raised their concerns against it.
And now you had talked
made as a result of those.
Sorry, you had talked a little bit about Martha with a conflict, and so I just want to assume like nothing was said about a conflict or anything in that meeting. Like that's also, they just have this space to be able to sort of speak their mind. And then from there, the vote goes through and you win. And was it like by a big margin, or was it tight?
There was only 3 votes in opposition, 2 of them being Martha and Garrett, and the other just being a board member who got, I guess, a little bit sidetracked based on the amendments that got made.
Okay.
But the amendments, there was a lot of discussion. The amendments were made very quickly, and they were talked about in response to concerns that like Martha and Garrett expressed, as well as a few other board members.
Right.
We were also kind of confused by the amendments at first, and we didn't know if we actually could celebrate the win.
Wow.
But then we were able to have a meeting with Don O'Leary, and he explained them, and it does not negate the fact that they have committed to full divestment.
Amazing. And I think this just has to do with if a company does like a massive transition towards renewable energy, where, sort of this idea of oil companies versus energy companies. And I think it kind of leaves the door a little bit open there in the way. But I also looked through the amendments as well, and I feel quite comfortable, in celebrating your victory with you. So, really, really well done. That is so awesome. So that must have been like a huge celebration. Like, I don't even know when you can't, like, I guess maybe you two, your roommates, you can like hug each other, but like you can't.
We were roommates at the time.
Okay, so like everything is virtual, like emojis, like just like celebrating like champagne. I don't know how you celebrate something like this in the time of COVID, but that must have just felt so awesome. And then from there, a bombshell drops, which is that Martha Billis resigns as chancellor. Yeah. So I can't imagine you knew this was coming. So you probably hear about it in the media, or maybe even by a reporter who's like calling for comment.
Both. Well, the president of the university sent out a message to everyone earlier that day, and so that was shared around within our group. We were like, whoa!
Very quickly, yeah, I would imagine.
This is crazy. And then since then, later that day, a number of reporters reached out to us.
And so this was, and I think, to me, it's just she, for whatever reason, and it sounded like she was in vocal opposition throughout the process. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like, it really was, there were some conflicts there. And I don't, I haven't explored it too much. I looked a little bit, but, it was just clear that sort of business interests. And for people who don't know, Martha is the controlling shareholder of Canadian Tire Corporation. And that, with her son, does own or have interest in a number of different sort of corporations and investment arms and sort of like trusts and things that themselves have all these investments. So it's one of these sort of like, box within a box type of situations. But, we can safely assume that she either has, significant direct investments in Alberta, in the Alberta energy sector, and or personal connections. Like, it did seem to me that this almost became a personal issue beyond just financial interests, and maybe even more so.
she actually did speak to her personal connections to the oil industry and growing up out west during the board meeting.
Okay.
So that was very clear.
Wow.
Her family ties, her personal ties, that kind of stuff she did mention in the board meeting.
And she felt that this was like a slight on sort of Alberta and like some of that community and that sector, certainly. So it's really interesting how, here in Canada, almost how personal it's gotten with this. And I think that, you're sort of coming at it. I totally understand your perspective of it. The way she's feeling it is a direct attack on her and her family and her community and sort of those things. So she, and as is her right, she ends up resigning. And so a question, Gab, I guess I'm trying to think, if she would have been handing out diplomas, like she would have handed you a diploma in your graduation, but now it'll be someone else, or I don't even know how you're going to get a diploma now, again, in the age of COVID. We'll figure that out. But it's like, but just to be clear, that's sort of like the main role of the chancellor, I think, is that there is sort of that personal thing. And now it's not going to be her, which, I imagine brings up some funny emotions in you.
It certainly does, yeah. And not on behalf of Fossil Free, but personally, I can't say I'm upset to have my diploma handed to me by someone else.
Yeah, totally. I'm with you there. And that, and that really it's, and what that did, just to be clear, is that, that's then set off a media, I would say, a bigger sort of firestorm, where this became, I would say, a very sort of localized issue in terms of our, sort of the people who care about divestment, my community, people who are listening to this, really, I would say sort of, sustainable investment nerds. And now all of a sudden, this was in the Globe and Mail, this was in the National Post, this was on CBC. Like, the fact that the chancellor resigned over this, in my mind, made it such a bigger news story. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Absolutely. It seemed a little ironic.
Oh my goodness.
But she kind of did us a favor in this.
She did you a huge favor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
And
thank you, Martha.
Yeah. Thank you, Martha. I mean, definitely, I would say amplified the amazing work that you've done. Cool. This is such an incredible story. I just want to give the chat a few moments. There was one question sort of a little bit earlier, in terms of the organization, but I would love to have more questions. If people do have questions, like please throw them in the chat. It's kind of interesting, and I feel like the question's a bit of a dig, I'll report it, but it asks, will the organization change their fuel sources? And I guess this is to say that, as an organization, like, it's understanding that you do sort of have personal ties to this. I think it's really important to understand the difference between, sort of someone who uses fossil fuels to be able to get around, to be able to, live the life that we have because we're within the system. I think investing in fossil fuels is a totally separate conversation than sort of fuel use. And that really, my perspective is that these are just crappy investments, both from a financial perspective and from an ethical perspective. I think unfortunately when it comes to fuel choices, a lot of us are sort of locked in to the infrastructure that is available. But maybe a good question would be, understanding that through this experience and looking at it through this investment lens, has that impacted you and your life and the way that you sort of the choices that you make and the way that you sort of see the world? How has that sort of evolved for you in this journey?
Yeah, we've had that kind of dig made at us quite a lot of times, just in relation to, being an individual living in the system versus, what we're advocating for. The thing that comes to mind right away with that, and definitely as I've learned throughout this process, is investments and where you put your monetary support show what kind of future you want.
Totally.
And what you want to see developed. And, with us all knowing that we need a more ethical and climate positive future, it doesn't make sense to invest in fossil fuels. We know it's not sustainable. We know they're going to become stranded assets. And I think, it's definitely changed the way I look at things and think about money and think about lifestyle and stuff like that.
Totally.
we want to change more about the system than just this, for sure. This is just one tangible thing that we decided to start with as a group.
Amazing.
Yeah, and I feel like in talking about divestment, it's important to recognize that we don't consider divestment to be a silver bullet.
Right.
We don't think that's going to save the world's issues. It's just one piece that we think is essential as a part of a much greater ecosystem of different actions and initiatives that are working to move us towards a more sustainable future.
Absolutely. And have you, is this a conversation you've had with like your family or your friends? Like now, obviously, you're getting the university to divest. And, obviously my mission is to help as many like individuals sort of align their portfolio with their values. But I imagine, this must have spurred a whole bunch of conversations about people's personal investments.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Hilarious. Well, feel free to point them my way. If ever anybody gets stuck, if they want to do it and they don't know how, that's what I'm doing. Another question from the chat, have you connected with any other university fossil-free groups that, obviously this is a bit of a movement here, so just curious to know, now that you've had this win, do you think, that this does create a bit of a ripple? I know there are a number of other universities who have, but I think there had been a bit of a gap. There hadn't been one for a little while. So just curious, on a national level, any organization taking place there?
Yeah, there is.
Cool.
There, on one hand, I think it has been really awesome this past year, actually, or just like not 2020, but 2020 within the full year. We've seen 2 Canadian universities commit to divestment before Guelph.
Amazing.
So there has been a bit of a ripple happening across the country already.
Yeah.
And kind of through that, we've created, not us personally, but the Fossil Free networks across Canada have, we've had at least 2 online Zoom call style things between many different divestment campaigns from across the country, and compared strategy and difficulties, and it was really wonderful. We got to learn from UBC, I think in January, about how they had just achieved divestment. And then not long ago, a few weeks ago, we chatted with McMaster about what we learned and how we achieved it, and then kind of trying to network and work together to make this happen on a broader scale in more places.
That's so cool.
On a personal level, it's been very cool to feel that broader connection of this movement nationally.
Absolutely.
And internationally.
Totally. Yeah. And so, really, what can we do to help that? I'm a little bit curious, you're both, it sounds like the educational sort of journey is over, that, is there anything that I can do, that we can do, as a community to help you? Like, is it really, supporting Fossil Free Guelph? Is it, sort of taking actions? Like, what do you need right now? How can we help you as individuals, and then potentially also the organization?
I feel like our next steps, as a group, working to make sure that this actually happens and keep that accountability on the university's behalf. But I think really the next steps are, how can we reinvest and how can we work towards supporting a just transition for people who are in the oil industry? Because while I don't necessarily agree with the way in which Martha Billis approached what she had to say, I agree in the sense of we can't leave people on the West Coast stranded, but we need to work towards ensuring that those workers and those people who are reliant on those jobs have a transition. So how can we reinvest money and invest money in order to ensure that we have high labor force jobs and good renewable jobs that are ethical, because that's a whole nother can of worms, but there are definitely a lot of renewable energy companies that aren't super clean and ethical. So I think for us, the next steps is kind of like, how can we as individuals, but also as a broader community, work towards supporting those industries and finding ones that are really good to support the transition.
Yeah, that's kind of where we've also gotten a lot of criticism in the past is, well, if they divest immediately, like what's that going to do to all the people who work in the industry? And that's something that we've always been, very concerned about. And we want to make sure that, the message is this divestment is gradual, just like the transition that we need to see also has to be gradual. And we want to make sure that, the working folks and everyone in our communities is able to be moved along in a good, positive, ethical way.
I love it. And, in the language that I often use, in terms of investment strategies, that it sounds like you've sort of succeeded on what I call the doing less evil part of the portfolio. So now we can sort of shift to carving out part of the pie for doing more good and sort of being intentional, and whether it's going to be green bonds or impact investments, that there is a whole world of, really positive, impactful things that are also really good from an investment perspective. So, definitely consider me an ally, that if I can support you, the organization, in any way, please don't hesitate to ask. I know a lot about the sort of the doing more good options. There's been a lot of interest from viewers about impact investments and sort of this idea. So, there's going to be hopefully even more options in the future. But, if there's any way I can help, if you're looking for research, if you're looking for any support whatsoever, know that I'm here for you. I'm so happy that you joined me on the show tonight. I can't tell you sort of how warm my heart is, and just knowing that you've had this massive win, and to hear your story, it's incredible. It's remarkable, and really, really happy for you, and, excited to see this movement continue to grow and blossom.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that and having us here. This has been really wonderful.
My pleasure. All right, I can see there's still a little bit of sunshine outside. So you enjoy your evening. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Also, just want to shout out to the Fossil Free homies in general, everyone who's been a part of this movement.
Yeah, it's been a huge movement over 7 years and many generations of people who put tons of work into it. So
absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, you have a wonderful evening.
Thank
you so much.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.